The fluorescent lights of Miller's diner buzzed softly against the evening silence, casting pale yellow reflections across the worn linoleum floor. Outside, the small town of Meadowbrook slept beneath a blanket of autumn darkness, its streets empty save for the occasional passing car. Inside the diner, the smell of fresh coffee and grilled onions hung in the air, mingling with the quiet chatter of late-night patrons seeking refuge from the cold. At a corner booth near the window sat James Carter, a 70-year-old black man whose silver hair caught the light like frost on winter grass. His weathered hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, steam rising between his fingers. On the lapel of his faded jacket hung a single military pin, tarnished with age but still bearing the unmistakable insignia of the United States Army. To most who passed him on the street, James was just another elderly man, anonymous in his ordinariness. Few knew that those same hands once held a rifle in the jungles of Vietnam, that those eyes had witnessed horrors most could never imagine, that this quiet soul had served his country with honor when it demanded everything from him. The diner door swung open with a sharp jingle, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop. 4 young men strode in, their laughter too loud, their movements too aggressive for the peaceful space. Leading them was Kyle Patterson, 24 years old, and dressed in expensive designer clothing that screamed of privilege. His father owned half the commercial real estate in town, a fact Kyle wielded like a weapon whenever he needed to remind people of their place beneath him. His eyes scanned the diner with predatory interest, looking for weakness, for entertainment, for someone to remind him of his own power. When his gaze landed on James, something dark flickered across Kyle's face. Perhaps it was the way the old man sat with quiet dignity, or perhaps it was simply the color of his skin in this predominantly white town. Whatever the reason, Kyle's lips curled into a sneer. He nudged his friends, whispered something that made them laugh, and began walking toward the corner booth. James sensed the approach before he looked up. After 7 decades of life, and a war that taught him to read danger in the air itself, he knew trouble when it walked through a door. But he remained still, his hands steady on the mug, his breathing even. He had faced worse than entitled boys playing at being men. Kyle stopped at the edge of the booth, towering over the seated veteran. The young man's cologne was overwhelming, expensive, and cloying. He tapped his fingers on the table, a rhythmic assault on the quiet James had been enjoying. The other patrons in the diner began to notice, their conversations dying mid-sentence, their eyes darting nervously between the confrontation and their plates. The tension built slowly, like storm clouds gathering on a summer horizon. James knew what was coming. He had seen this scene play out before, in different places, different times, but always with the same ugly script. Hatred, wearing the mask of superiority. Cruelty dressed up as entertainment. He raised his eyes to meet Kyle's stare, and in that moment, the young man saw something that should have warned him, should have made him turn away and choose a different path. In James Carter's eyes lived the kind of strength that only comes from surviving the unsurvivable, from facing death and choosing honor anyway. But Kyle was too drunk on his own arrogance to recognize the warning. What happened next would shatter the peace of Meadowbrook and set in motion a chain of events that would expose the rot beneath the town's pleasant surface. The slap that was coming would echo far beyond the walls of this small diner, would reverberate through halls of power, and force a reckoning that no one could have predicted. Because what Kyle Patterson did not know, could not have known in his bubble of privilege and ignorance, was that the old man sitting before him was not alone in this world. That somewhere in Washington, in an office marked with government seals and classified clearances, sat a son who loved his father more than his own life, and who possessed the power to make the earth itself tremble. Miller's Diner had been a fixture of Meadowbrook for 43 years, since the day Harold Miller opened its doors with nothing but a dream and a second mortgage on his house. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the waitresses remembered how you took your coffee, and the cook knew your standing order before you opened your mouth. James Carter had been coming here since he returned from Vietnam in 1973, back when his hair was still black and his step was still quick with youth. He had built a quiet life in this town, working first at the local factory, and then, after his knees gave out, at the hardware store where he helped young families pick out paint colors and taught kids how to properly grip a hammer. His wife, Eleanor, had passed 7 years ago, leaving behind a house too big for one man, and memories that filled every corner. But the town had been kind to him in his grief, and the diner had become his refuge, a place where he could sit with his thoughts and his coffee and feel, for a few hours at least, that he was part of something larger than his loneliness. The other regulars knew him by name. Sarah, the head waitress, who had worked the evening shift for 20 years, always saved him the corner booth. Tom Chen, who ran the pharmacy next door, often joined him for a late dinner and conversation about baseball and grandchildren. Even the young people in town, the ones who had grown up seeing him as a fixture on Main Street, treated him with the casual respect reserved for harmless elders. But respect, James had learned long ago, was not universal. It could not be assumed simply because it was deserved. And tonight, in the person of Kyle Patterson, he was about to be reminded of that bitter truth. Kyle's friends had spread out behind him, forming a semicircle that blocked James from easy exit. They were younger versions of Kyle. Boys playing at being tough, feeding off each other's false courage like hyenas circling wounded prey. One of them held up his phone, recording, though whether for posterity or entertainment was unclear. "Hey, old man," Kyle said, his voice carrying across the now silent diner. "You know you're in my seat, right?" James looked at him steadily, his expression unchanged. He had learned in the war that the first rule of de-escalation was to give anger nothing to grab onto, to be water when confronted with fire. "I don't believe these seats are assigned, son," he said quietly, his voice rough with age, but firm with dignity. Kyle's face flushed at being called son by a black man old enough to be his grandfather. His friends snickered. Whether at James or at Kyle's discomfort was impossible to tell. The young man leaned down, putting his hands on the table, his face inches from James's. His breath smelled of alcohol and mint, a combination that turned James's stomach. "I don't think you heard me right," Kyle said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is my town. My family built half these buildings, and I don't like looking at your face while I'm trying to eat my dinner." The words hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Several patrons gasped. Sarah dropped a plate in the kitchen, the crash echoing like punctuation. But no one moved. No one stood up. No one came to James's defense. Because Kyle Patterson was right about one thing. His family did own half the town. And crossing them meant losing your job, your lease, your livelihood. James felt the old familiar weight settle over him, the same suffocating pressure he had felt in the military, when white officers looked through him like he was invisible, the same crushing disappointment that came with being reduced to nothing more than the color of his skin. But beneath the disappointment ran something harder. Something forged in the fire of combat and tempered by 70 years of surviving, in a world that had never wanted him to succeed. "I'm not looking for trouble," James said evenly. "I'm just an old man having his coffee. There are plenty of other seats." Kyle straightened up, a smile spreading across his face that held no warmth, only cruelty. "Yeah, there are other seats. So why don't you shuffle your old ass over to one of them, maybe in the back, where I don't have to see you?" The reference was clear, deliberate. The back of the bus. The back of the restaurant. The back of the line. All the places where men like James had been told they belonged. As if their very existence was an offense to be hidden away. His jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the rage building beneath his calm exterior. "I'm staying right here," James said quietly. What happened next occurred so fast that several witnesses would later give conflicting accounts. Kyle's hand shot out, connecting with James's face in a sharp, vicious slap that sent the old man's head snapping to the side. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot. James's coffee mug tumbled from his hands, shattering on the floor in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, where his teeth had caught his lip. For a moment, no one breathed. No one moved. The world seemed to hang, suspended in that terrible instant. hovering between what had just happened and what would come next. James raised a hand slowly to his face, touching the blood at his lip. His expression remained unchanged, but his eyes, those eyes that had seen the worst humanity had to offer and survived anyway, held something that made even Kyle take an involuntary step backward. It was not anger, it was not fear, it was something far more dangerous. The cold, clear certainty of a man who knows that justice, however delayed, however long in coming, is inevitable. Kyle seemed to sense he had crossed a line he could not uncross, but pride and the presence of his friends would not let him back down. "Next time, old man," he said loudly, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You'll move when I tell you to move." He turned and strode out of the diner, his friends following like pilot fish trailing a shark. The door swung shut behind them, and the silence that remained was deafening. Sarah rushed over with napkins, her hands shaking as she helped James clean his face. Tom Chen stood up from his booth, his face pale with anger and shame, but James waved him away. Other patrons pulled out their phones, not to call the police, but to capture what had just happened, to document this moment of violence and hatred that had shattered the illusion of their peaceful town. James stood slowly, his joints protesting, and walked to the door with as much dignity as a 70-year-old man with blood on his face could muster. Sarah tried to protest, but he shook his head. "I'm all right," he said, though they both knew it was a lie. "I just need to go home." As he pushed through the door into the cold night air, James Carter had no way of knowing that the video being uploaded from a dozen phones would reach far beyond Meadowbrook, would travel across state lines and through digital networks, until it landed in a place where someone who loved him more than life itself would see it and feel his world crack in two. 580 miles away, in an office high in a Washington government building, Michael Carter sat at his desk, reviewing security briefings that could decide the fate of millions. At 40 years old, he had risen through the ranks of the Department of Homeland Security with the same quiet determination his father had shown in everything he did. His colleagues knew him as brilliant but reserved, a man who spoke softly and chose his words with care, but whose decisions carried the weight of absolute authority. His office was austere, decorated only with a photograph of his late mother and a painting of the Washington Monument his daughter had made in second grade. On his desk sat 3 secure phones, 2 computer monitors displaying classified information, and a single personal cell phone that he checked only during breaks, a small concession to the life that existed outside these walls. He was in the middle of a conference call with field agents in 6 different cities when his personal phone buzzed with a notification. He ignored it, focusing instead on the operational details being discussed, on the movements of persons of interest and the allocation of resources. The call lasted another 20 minutes, and it was only after he disconnected that Michael allowed himself to glance at his phone. It was a message from Tom Chen, the pharmacist who lived 2 doors down from his father. Tom had been like an uncle to Michael growing up, had taught him to ride a bike, and helped him with his science homework when Eleanor was too tired from her double shifts at the nursing home. They stayed in touch, mostly through occasional calls and messages about how James was doing. Whether he was eating enough, whether his arthritis was getting worse. The message was short. "You need to see this. It's about your father." Below it was a link. Michael felt his stomach drop even before he clicked it, some primal instinct warning him that whatever he was about to see would change everything. The video loaded slowly, buffering for a moment before beginning to play. The angle was shaky, shot from across a room, but the scene was clear enough. His father, sitting in a booth. A young white man standing over him, shouting. Words that even through the poor audio quality carried their venom clearly. And then the slap, sharp and brutal, sending James's head to the side and blood spraying across the table. Michael watched the video 3 times. The first viewing was shock, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. The second was analytical, cataloging every detail, every face, every piece of evidence. The third viewing was pure rage, a white-hot fury that threatened to consume everything he had built, everything he stood for. He stood up so abruptly his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. His hands were shaking. He realized distantly, actually trembling with an emotion so powerful it felt like it might tear him apart from the inside. He tried to call his father, but the phone rang through to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. Michael grabbed his personal phone and his jacket and strode out of his office, past his assistant who called after him with questions about his afternoon meetings, past colleagues who looked up in surprise at seeing the normally composed director moving with such purpose, such barely contained violence in every step. In the elevator going down, he watched the video a fourth time. This time, he noticed other details. The way the other patrons looked away. The way no one intervened. The way his father, even in that moment of humiliation and pain, maintained his dignity, his quiet strength. By the time Michael reached his car, he had made a decision. He would not let this stand. Not today. Not ever. His father had given everything to this country, had bled for it, had sacrificed his youth and his health, and this was how he was repaid, with violence and hatred and the turning away of eyes that should have seen him as a hero? No. Michael Carter was many things: a government official, a father, a public servant. But before all of that, he was James Carter's son, and he would remind the world what it meant to hurt someone he loved. He made 3 phone calls from his car. The first was to his deputy, clearing his schedule for the next 72 hours and citing a family emergency. The second was to his sister, Rachel, who lived in Denver with her husband and 2 kids, telling her what had happened and that he was handling it. The third call was to a friend who worked in the FBI's cyber division, someone who owed him favors and knew better than to ask too many questions. "I need you to find everything on someone," Michael said, his voice deadly calm. "Everything. I'm sending you a video. I want to know who this person is, where he lives, where he works, who his family is, what skeletons are in his closet. And I want it yesterday." "Mike, you know I can't just—" "Sam," Michael interrupted, his voice dropping even lower. "Someone put their hands on my father. So either you help me, or I start making official requests through channels that will put this person and everyone associated with them under a microscope that won't go away for years." "Your choice." There was a long pause. "Send me the video," Sam finally said. Michael drove through the night, pushing his car past the speed limit, running on adrenaline and rage. He made the trip from Washington to Meadowbrook in just under 7 hours, arriving as dawn was breaking over the small town. The streets were empty, the stores still dark, the world not yet awake to the storm that was coming. He went straight to his father's house, letting himself in with the key he had kept since childhood. James was sitting in the living room, still dressed in the clothes from the night before, staring at the wall with an expression that broke Michael's heart. There was a bruise blooming on his cheek, purple and angry, and the cut on his lip had stopped bleeding but looked painful. "Dad," Michael said softly. And James turned to look at him with eyes that seemed suddenly older, more tired than Michael had ever seen them. "You shouldn't have come," James said. "You have important work." "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Michael said, crossing the room to kneel in front of his father's chair. "And I'm exactly where I should be." He reached out and gently touched his father's face, examining the bruise with the careful attention of someone cataloging evidence for a case that would not be dismissed or forgotten. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly, and James did. He told Michael everything, from Kyle's first cruel words to the moment of violence, to the silence of the witnesses who could have intervened but chose safety over courage. As he spoke, Michael felt his rage crystallize into something colder, more focused. Rage was useful, but it was also blind. What he needed now was clarity, precision, the same qualities that had made him successful in a job where mistakes could cost lives. When James finished, Michael stood and pulled out his phone. "What's his name?" he asked. "Son, don't do anything that's going to get you in trouble," James said, alarm in his voice. "That boy's family has money, has connections. It's not worth it." "His name," Michael repeated, and something in his tone made James understand that this was not a request. "Kyle Patterson," James said quietly. "His father is Richard Patterson." They own most of the commercial property in town. Michael typed rapidly on his phone, then looked up at his father with an expression that was almost frightening in its cold determination. "You let me worry about the Pattersons," he said. "You just rest. I'll handle this." "Michael, Dad." Michael knelt again, taking his father's weathered hands in his own. "You spent your whole life protecting people. You went to war for this country. You raised me and Rachel by yourself after Mom died. You taught me what honor means, what duty means. You have never asked anyone for help. Never demanded the respect you deserved. But this time, you're going to let me fight for you. Just this once. Please." James looked at his son, seeing in him the same intensity he had once possessed. The same unwavering commitment to what was right. He nodded slowly, and Michael squeezed his hands before standing. The information from Sam came through over the next 48 hours, and it painted a picture that was far more damning than Michael had dared hope. Kyle Patterson had a history of violence, with 3 separate assault complaints that had been mysteriously dismissed before charges were filed. His father, Richard Patterson, had used his money and influence to make problems disappear, had paid off victims and pressured witnesses, but that was just the surface. As Sam dug deeper, following financial records and property transactions, a darker pattern emerged. The Patterson real estate empire was built on a foundation of fraudulent contracts, tax evasion, and loans from sources that set off every alarm in Sam's federal databases. There were connections to organized crime, to money laundering operations, to a network of corruption that had infected Meadowbrook for decades. Michael read through the files with the focused attention of a predator studying its prey. Every piece of information was a weapon, every connection another thread to pull until the whole ugly tapestry unraveled. But he did not move precipitously. He did not let anger dictate his actions. Instead, he did what he had been trained to do. He built a case so airtight that no amount of money or influence could escape its grip. On the 3rd day after the incident, Michael returned to Miller's diner. It was late afternoon, the same time his father usually took his coffee. He ordered a black coffee and a slice of apple pie, and sat in the same corner booth where James had been sitting 3 nights earlier. He did not have to wait long. Kyle Patterson walked in with 2 of his friends, the same young men who had stood by while their leader committed violence against an elderly veteran. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying the careless arrogance of those who had never faced real consequences. Kyle saw Michael immediately, and something in the stranger's bearing made him pause. Michael was wearing a suit, expensive but understated, and he sat with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to power. He did not look up when Kyle entered, did not acknowledge the young man's presence. And somehow that was more threatening than a direct stare. "Can I help you?" Kyle said, walking over to Michael's booth with forced bravado. "You're in my spot." Michael looked up slowly, and when his eyes met Kyle's, the young man took an involuntary step backward. There was something in that gaze that spoke of authority, of consequences, of a world far larger and more dangerous than Kyle Patterson had ever imagined. "Am I?" Michael said mildly. "How strange. I was under the impression that public establishments operated on a first-come, first-served basis." Kyle's face flushed. "Listen, buddy. I don't know who you think you are." "I'm Michael Carter," Michael interrupted, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge that could cut steel. "The man you assaulted 3 nights ago was my father." The color drained from Kyle's face. His friends, sensing danger, began to edge toward the door. But Kyle was frozen, caught between the impulse to flee and the pride that would not let him show fear in front of his town, his territory. "I don't know what you're talking about," Kyle said. But his voice lacked conviction. Michael pulled out his phone and played the video. The sound of the slap echoed through the diner, and every patron turned to watch. Sarah, wiping down tables, stopped and stared. Tom Chen, who had been reading the newspaper in his usual booth, stood up slowly. "That's assault," Michael said, conversationally. putting his phone away. Against a senior citizen. Against a military veteran. Caught on multiple devices. Witnesses present. In most jurisdictions, that's a felony. My father will. Your father, Michael, interrupted again, is currently being investigated by the IRS for tax fraud, by the FBI for money laundering, and by multiple state agencies for various violations of property and construction law. Your family's assets are in the process of being frozen, pending the outcome of those investigations. Your father's arrest warrant will be executed tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Would you like to know how I know this? Kyle said nothing, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Because, Michael continued, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket, I am the Deputy Director of Homeland Security, and when I make a phone call, when I ask certain questions and point certain people in certain directions, things happen, mountains move, empires crumble, and entitled little boys, who think their money makes them untouchable, discover exactly how wrong they are. He stepped closer to Kyle, close enough that he could see the sweat beading on the young man's forehead, could smell the fear underneath the expensive cologne. You put your hands on my father, Michael said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent diner. You humiliated a man who gave everything for this country, who survived things you could never imagine, who has more honor in his smallest finger than you will ever possess in your entire worthless life. And you did it because you thought you could. Because you thought no one would stop you. Because you thought he was alone. Michael leaned in even closer. He's not alone. He has never been alone. And now you're going to learn what it means to face consequences. Real consequences. The kind that money can't fix and influence can't erase. He stepped back and picked up his coffee, taking a casual sip. The police will be here shortly to arrest you for assault. I've already spoken with the district attorney. Given the evidence and the public attention this case has received, they're very eager to prosecute. I believe the phrase used was, slam dunk case. After that? Well, he smiled, and it was not a kind expression. I suppose we'll see how you enjoy being just another person in the system. Without special treatment. Without shortcuts. Without your father's money smoothing the path. Welcome to how the rest of the world lives, Kyle. I hope you enjoy your stay. The police arrived 5 minutes later. Kyle Patterson was arrested on charges of assault and battery, while his friends watched helplessly. The video had gone viral in the preceding days, shared across the country, picked up by news outlets major and minor. What had been a local incident of violence became a national story about privilege, racism, and justice deferred, but not denied. The trial, when it came, was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. The video alone would have been enough. But Michael had ensured there was more. Statements from other victims of Kyle's violence, who had been too afraid to speak out before, financial records showing the Patterson family's pattern of paying off complaints, testimony from experts on hate crimes and the particular vulnerability of elderly victims. The courtroom was packed. James Carter sat in the front row, Michael beside him. Their hands clasped together. Members of the veterans community had come from across the state. Old men and women in faded uniforms who had served their country and wanted to stand with one of their own. The story had touched something deep in the American consciousness, had reminded people that the price of freedom had been paid by those who now walked among them quietly, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, deserving everything. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, a cheer went up from the gallery. The judge had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order. Kyle Patterson, once so arrogant and untouchable, sat with his head in his hands, finally understanding the weight of his actions. The sentencing was yet to come, but the conviction itself felt like vindication, like proof that the system could still work when enough light was shone on darkness. When enough voices refused to be silent. Outside the courthouse, James Carter stood on the steps, surrounded by supporters and press. Michael had wanted to speak for him, but James had gently declined. There were things that needed to be said, and they needed to be said by the man who had been wronged. "I want to thank everyone who came today," James said, his voice steady despite his age, despite the ordeal. This was never about revenge. It was about dignity, about the principle that in America, every person deserves respect regardless of their age, their race, their station in life. We all bleed the same. We all deserve to sit in a diner and drink our coffee in peace. He paused, looking out at the crowd, at the cameras broadcasting his words across the nation. "I served this country in Vietnam. I came home to a nation that didn't always welcome me, that didn't always see my service as valuable, but I never stopped believing in America, in the idea that we can be better than our worst moments. Today proved that belief wasn't misplaced. Justice can be slow, but it can also be certain, and that's worth fighting for." The applause was thunderous. That evening, Michael and James sat together on the porch of the house where Michael had grown up, watching the sun set over Meadowbrook. The bruise on James's face had faded to yellow, the cut on his lip nearly healed, but the real healing, they both knew, went deeper than the physical. "You didn't have to do all this," James said quietly. "You risked your career, your reputation." "No," Michael corrected gently. "I reminded people what my career, my reputation, my position of power is actually for. It's not about status or authority. It's about protecting people. And you're not just people, Dad. You're my father. You're my hero. And I would burn down the world before I let anyone hurt you and walk away from it." James turned to look at his son, seeing the man he had raised, the man Eleanor would have been so proud of. He reached out and pulled Michael into a hug, and they sat there as the light faded. Two generations bound by love and blood, and the unshakable conviction that some things are worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed, Meadowbrook changed. The prosecution of the Patterson family exposed corruption that had poisoned the town for years. New leadership emerged, younger and more diverse, committed to building a community where everyone truly was equal under the law. Miller's Diner became something of a pilgrimage site, people coming from across the country to sit in the booth where James Carter had faced hatred with dignity and sparked a movement. James himself became an unlikely symbol, invited to speak at veterans' events and civil rights gatherings. He accepted some invitations and declined others, still preferring his quiet life, but willing to step into the spotlight when he believed his words might matter. Michael returned to Washington, to his duties and responsibilities, but he came home more often now, making time for coffee with his father and long walks through the town. The job would always be demanding, the crises would always come, but he had learned something important in those dark days after the assault. Power was meaningless if you did not use it to protect the people you loved, to defend the principles you claimed to believe in. 1 year after the incident, on a crisp autumn evening remarkably similar to that terrible night, James Carter walked into Miller's Diner and took his usual seat. Sarah brought him coffee without asking, and Tom Chen slid into the booth across from him with a smile. The diner was full of people, friends and neighbors, the familiar faces that made a place feel like home. As James lifted his mug and took that first satisfying sip, he thought about how far they had all come, about the long road from violence to justice, from silence to solidarity. He thought about his son, his brilliant, fierce, loyal son, and about the way love can move mountains when it is backed by will and the courage to act. The door opened, and a young black family walked in, parents and 2 small children, looking for a place to eat. They chose a table near the window, settling in with the easy confidence of people who knew they were welcome, who did not have to wonder if they would be served, if they would be safe, if they belonged. James watched them for a moment. Watched the children laugh at something their father said. Watched the mother relax into her seat with the relief of a person who had been driving for too long and was grateful for the rest. And he smiled, because this, finally, was what he had fought for all those years ago in a jungle far from home. Not just freedom in the abstract, but this moment, this family, This peace. The world was not perfect. Meadowbrook was not perfect. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront. But on this evening, in this diner, surrounded by community and coffee and the quiet triumph of having stood up and been heard, James Carter felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Have felt hope, and that, in the end, was worth everything.